Breaking news. Canada is tightening the screws on US steel, and what looks like a technical trade move is rapidly turning into a serious tariff confrontation that could hit prices, jobs, and the entire North American manufacturing pipeline. And here's the question nobody wants to answer directly. If Canada and the United States can't keep steel flowing smoothly across the border, what happens to the cars, buildings, and factories that depend on it every single day? Tonight, I'm going to break down 3 things with urgency. First, what Canada is actually doing when headlines say it's blocking US steel, because modern trade wars often work through cost and friction, not literal bans. Second, why this escalates right now and how it fits into a broader tariff cycle that keeps intensifying. Third, who really pays when governments weaponize trade? Spoiler, it's rarely the decision makers. Here's what's happening in plain language. Canada has rolled back many counter tariffs on US goods, but it has deliberately kept countermeasures in place on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. While negotiations remain tense, Canada's government frames this as a response to the US maintaining tariffs in these sectors without exemptions for COSMA-compliant goods, which means Canada is keeping pressure where it believes it still has leverage. That's the official posture, and it matters because steel is not just another import category. Steel is the backbone input behind manufacturing, construction, machinery, and vehicles. When steel becomes a bargaining chip, entire supply chains feel the shock. Now, let's talk numbers because this story is not symbolic. Canada's official materials describe retaliatory measures totaling about $29.8 billion in targeted goods, including $12.6 billion in steel products and $3 billion in aluminum products, plus $14.2 billion in additional goods. These are not small gestures. These are large-scale levers designed to change real purchasing decisions and force real supply chain shifts. Canada also points to the scale of the USC-Canada trading relationship itself, stating that about $2.5 billion worth of goods and services cross the border every day. That figure matters because it tells you how integrated these economies are. When you add friction to one of the most essential inputs in the system, you don't just inconvenience importers, you destabilize predictable production. And it gets worse because tariffs don't stay inside neat categories. Steel tariffs don't remain a steel problem. They turn into a cost problem for manufacturers and a reliability problem for the people who rely on them. Let me humanize this with one realistic picture. Imagine a mid-sized US fabrication shop that supplies parts to regional contractors. That shop survives on 2 things: stable material costs and on-time delivery. The moment tariffs inject uncertainty into steel pricing and availability, that owner isn't debating ideology. They're deciding whether to raise prices, cut hours, or risk losing customers. That's how a trade war reaches a family kitchen table without warning. To understand why this is serious, you have to understand what blocking looks like in modern trade conflicts. In most cases, governments don't need to announce a hard ban. They can restrict trade through cost pressure, administrative friction, and targeted measures that make imports uncompetitive. A tariff doesn't have to be permanent to be damaging. It only has to create uncertainty long enough for companies to change behavior. Once supply chains shift, they rarely snap back quickly. Canada's official position makes this strategy visible. It says many counter tariffs were removed, but counter tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain in effect while negotiations continue, specifically because the US maintains tariffs in those sectors. That is a classic leverage strategy. Relieve pressure broadly, but keep the chokehold on the high-impact sectors. Now here's the critical point that most headlines miss. Steel is a multiplier input. Steel doesn't sit on a shelf as steel. It immediately becomes an input into higher value production. Steel flows into automotive components, machinery, tools, construction beams, appliances, and industrial equipment. When you disrupt steel, you are effectively disrupting the cost base of a large portion of the real economy. That's why steel tariffs can look small on paper but produce outsized downstream damage. The data points Canada publishes help show scale and structure. In describing its counter Measures. Canada references a total package of about $29.8 billion in goods, including $12.66 billion in steel, $3 billion in aluminum, and $14.2 billion in additional imported goods. That breakdown matters because it tells you the strategy. Hit core industrial materials and then broaden the pain into other categories to create political and commercial pressure across the border. Canada also describes earlier countermeasures targeting roughly $30 billion in imported U.S. goods across consumer and industrial categories. And it details auto-related countermeasures using a 25% tariff structure tied to CUSMA compliance frameworks. Those auto measures are important because they show the conflict is not limited to raw materials. It reaches finished goods and complex rule-based supply chains, where compliance and paperwork can become another tool of friction. So why does this escalatory pattern keep returning? Because tariffs create displacement. When one major market tightens access, producers look for other destinations. Canada has publicly expressed concern about being heavily impacted when global steel dynamics shift and supply chains route, especially when tariffs elsewhere push steel into new markets. Reporting on Canadian policy debates has described Canada's concern that displaced steel could overwhelm its domestic market as trade actions reshape global flows. Now, let's talk cause and effect, because this is where tension should peak. When steel becomes unpredictable, manufacturers don't just pay more. They lose planning power. They can't price contracts confidently. They can't guarantee delivery schedules. They can't commit to production runs with the same certainty. That uncertainty becomes layoffs, delayed investment, and slower growth. Even Canada's own government warns that tariffs increase costs, disrupt supply chains, and can lead businesses to delay investments due to sudden uncertainty in trade relations. Here's an analogy that makes the whole situation obvious. Think of North American manufacturing like a tightly tuned engine with crossbar parts moving in perfect timing. Tariffs are sand in the gearbox. The machine still runs, but the friction builds, the efficiency drops, and the cost rises, and eventually, something gives. The scary part is that by the time the public notices, the damage is already baked into prices and paychecks. Now, let's get specific about who gets hit, because this isn't an abstract policy seminar. This is real life. Start with American workers and families. When steel costs rise or steel supply becomes uncertain, downstream industries respond in predictable steps. First, companies cut overtime. Then, they slow hiring. Then, they delay capital investment. If uncertainty persists, shifts get reduced. That's not ideology. That's budgeting in the auto supply chain where steel-heavy components are time-sensitive. Even small disruptions ripple through scheduling and production. If your plant depends on steady inputs and a narrow margin, trade friction turns into workforce pressure quickly. Families feel it too because steel is embedded in the cost of goods. Construction and home repair costs can rise when materials become more expensive or volatile. Vehicle prices are sensitive to supply chain cost spikes and appliances, and machinery are often steel-intensive. Canada's own government explicitly warns that tariffs will raise prices for American businesses and consumers and disrupt American supply chains, creating inflationary pressures in the U.S. That is a direct acknowledgement of downstream impact. Next, small businesses. Here's a realistic case study. Picture a small U.S. manufacturer that produces brackets, housings, or specialized metal components for HVAC or industrial clients. Their contracts are quoted weeks ahead. Their profit margin is not built for sudden swings in input cost. If steel pricing becomes volatile, that business has only bad options. They can raise prices and risk losing customers, hold prices and take losses, or delay projects and damage their reputation. And here's the kicker. Uncertainty also affects financing. Lenders do not like unstable input costs, and insurance costs can rise when contracts become riskier. A trade conflict can squeeze a small business without a single dramatic headline. Large corporations react differently, but they are not immune. They can hedge and diversify suppliers, but they still hate unpredictability.